Coming back from deployment is always a strange experience. You spend months, sometimes years, in a place where every day is about discipline, survival, and duty. Then suddenly, you're back on American soil, standing in the quiet suburbs where the biggest daily concern is whether someone's lawn is half an inch too long. For me, stepping off that plane was supposed to mean peace. It was supposed to mean home. But what I walked into was nothing close to peace, and nothing close to home. When I left for deployment, my house was in order. My mortgage was up to date. My paperwork filed neatly, and my property carefully looked after. I had a small piece of land that I was proud of. Land my father and I had once dreamed of turning into something more. It wasn't just dirt and grass to me. It was a reminder of family, sacrifice, and stability. Before I left, I signed every document needed to protect it. I even placed a copy of my deed in a fireproof safe. I trusted that when I came back, everything would be exactly as I left it. But nothing prepared me for the sight that awaited me when I drove down that familiar road. My land was no longer mine, at least not according to the bold, freshly painted HOA signs that now stood at every corner. "Welcome to Evergreen Meadows, a deed-restricted community." I slowed my truck, disbelief setting in as I scanned the neighborhood. Where there used to be open space, there were fences. Where there used to be my family's oak tree, there was a polished concrete walkway with HOA-approved shrubs lined up like obedient soldiers. The subdivision had swallowed my property whole, and according to the signage, the HOA was in full control. I pulled into what used to be my driveway, only to find it freshly paved, marked, and lined with visitor parking rules. A laminated notice hung crookedly from a stake in the ground. Community. Property, unauthorized vehicles will be towed. It was surreal, like someone had rewritten reality in my absence. I walked to my front door, hoping at least that part of my world remained intact. But instead of my familiar brass handle, I found a padlock. On the door was a notice stamped in bold red ink. Property. Under the jurisdiction of Evergreen Meadows HOA, unauthorized occupancy prohibited. I stood there in uniform, boots still dusty from deployment, staring at the piece of paper that claimed to erase my rights as a homeowner. The rage that boiled up inside me was unlike anything I'd felt overseas. Out there, the enemy wore a uniform. Out here, the enemy wore polo shirts and carried clipboards. The neighbors peeked through their blinds, whispering. I could almost hear their judgments. There's the soldier, the one who thinks he still owns that house. Doesn't he know? The HOA took care of it. I didn't knock. I didn't yell. Instead, I got back into my truck and drove straight to the county records office. If there was one thing I knew, it was that paperwork never lies. The clerk at the desk hesitated when I gave her my address. She pulled up the file, brows furrowing as she scrolled. Finally, she printed a stack of documents and slid them across the counter. "According to our records, sir, your property was transferred to Evergreen Meadows Homeowners Association 8 months ago." "Transferred?" I asked, my voice colder than I intended. She nodded, uncomfortable. The board filed a claim that the property had been abandoned. Since no taxes were listed as being paid during that period, it was assumed to be forfeited. That was impossible. My military pay had continued automatically. I had a system set up for my mortgage and taxes. There was no way it had been abandoned. I flipped through the documents, my hands tightening with every page. The signatures didn't match mine. The paperwork was sloppy, rushed, and riddled with errors. Yet somehow it had been processed and approved. And just like that, my land, my home, had been sold out from under me by the very organization that was supposed to protect the neighborhood. The HOA had stolen my property while I was serving my country, and they thought I wouldn't notice. But here's the thing. The military teaches you many skills: discipline, endurance, strategy. But above all, it teaches you never to back down from a fight worth having. I went back to my truck, parked under the fading evening sun, and pulled out my phone. I didn't call a lawyer. I didn't call the county. I called the base. Because what the HOA didn't know was that land ownership rights for active duty personnel aren't something you can just scribble away with forged signatures and shady filings. There are federal protections, and when those protections are violated, it doesn't just become a legal matter. It becomes a military one. By the time I hung up, the course of action was clear. The HOA had declared war on me in my absence. But they didn't understand the battlefield they had just stepped onto. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in the cab of my truck, overlooking what used to be my house, watching the porch light of my stolen property flicker on as if mocking me. The HOA board members gathered at one of their homes across the street, no doubt patting themselves on the back for their successful expansion, but they didn't know the storm that was coming. They had written me off as just another homeowner who could be bullied into silence. What they failed to understand was that I wasn't alone. The military had my back, and soon so would the law. This was only the beginning. And if Evergreen Meadows thought they could erase me from the picture, they were about to learn a lesson in ownership, discipline, and consequences that no board meeting agenda could ever prepare them for. Because I wasn't just fighting for my land anymore. I was fighting for the principle that no one, no HOA, no board, no smug neighbor with a clipboard, had the right to steal from someone who had sacrificed everything to serve. The war for Evergreen Meadows had begun. The morning after I discovered the padlock on my own front door, I began my counterattack. Not with shouting, not with fists. No, that would have been too easy for them. The HOA thrived on emotional outbursts because that gave them power. But what they weren't prepared for was the cold, methodical way the military approaches a problem. The first step was documentation. Every soldier knows you don't move without intel, and I wasn't about to charge blind into this fight. I returned to the county office and requested certified copies of every document tied to my property. Deed transfers, tax records, notices. If it had my address on it, I wanted it in my hands. The clerk handed me a stack of papers thicker than a field manual. I flipped through them at a nearby table, my jaw tightening with every line I read. The abandonment claim had been filed only 6 weeks after I deployed overseas. 6 weeks, as if simply being away from home meant I'd forfeited my rights as a property owner. The signature on the transfer was laughably fake. It looked like someone had tried to trace my name from a scanned document, shaky and uneven. And yet the county had processed it, rubber-stamped by a notary whose credentials I couldn't even verify. The HOA had manipulated the system, hoping no one would ever look closely enough to call them out. But they'd made one fatal mistake. They messed with someone who had both the discipline to chase them down and the legal protections of active duty service. Back at base, I met with a Judge Advocate General Officer, a JAG. He listened carefully as I laid out the timeline, flipping through my stack of documents like they were evidence at a court-martial. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair, frowning. "They sold your property while you were deployed?" he asked. I nodded. He exhaled slowly. "That's not just fraud. That's a violation of the Servicemembers Civil Relief Act. Federal law. If what you're showing me is correct, this HOA isn't just facing a lawsuit. They're staring down criminal charges." Hearing that felt like the first breath of relief since I'd set foot back home. For months, the HOA had been parading around Evergreen Meadows as if they were untouchable, handing out fines, rewriting rules, and bullying residents into submission. But now, for the first time, they were vulnerable. The JAG officer promised to escalate the case immediately. Within hours, military legal teams were contacting county officials, demanding explanations for how a soldier's property could have been transferred illegally. The tone of those conversations was not polite. It was commanding. Meanwhile, I returned to Evergreen Meadows. I parked on the edge of what used to be my land and sat there quietly, watching the neighborhood. The board members came and went in, Their neatly pressed khakis and pastel shirts, their clipboards tucked under their arms like shields. They waved to residents with fake smiles, but I could see the unease in their eyes. Word was spreading. They knew I was back. That evening, the HOA president, an older man with a perfectly trimmed beard and the smug confidence of someone who thought he owned the world, approached my truck. He tapped on the window with 2 fingers, smiling like a politician. I rolled it down an inch. "You can't park here," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "This is community property now." I held up the certified deed copy I'd just collected, pressing it against the glass. "Not according to this." His smile faltered for a split second, but he quickly recovered. "That deed is outdated. The transfer was completed months ago. You'll find the HOA owns this land now and you're trespassing." I rolled the window back up without a word. I didn't need to argue. He could cling to his delusion for a little while longer. The truth was already in motion, and soon it would crush him. 2 days later, the board received their first official notice. A courier arrived with a thick envelope marked with military seals. I watched from my truck as the HOA president opened it on his porch, his confident grin collapsing as his eyes darted across the pages. His wife peeked over his shoulder, her hand flying to her mouth. The notice was clear. They were under federal investigation. By the end of the week, panic had set in. Emergency board meetings were held late into the night. Residents whispered about strange cars parked at the subdivision entrance, unmarked government vehicles, their drivers watching silently. The once cocky board members now avoided eye contact when they passed me. But still, they weren't ready to give up. Desperation breeds recklessness, and the HOA's next move proved just how far they were willing to go. One evening, I found a fresh notice taped to my truck windshield. "Cease and desist. Continued presence in this community will result in fines and legal action." The audacity almost made me laugh. They were already under investigation for fraud and forgery, and their response was to double down, threatening the very person who held the evidence of their crimes. It was like watching an amateur poker player go all in on a losing hand, but I didn't rip the notice down in anger. No, I slid it carefully into a folder, labeled and dated. Another piece of evidence. Another nail in their coffin. By now, residents were starting to take sides. Some whispered words of support when they thought no one was watching. "We know what they did to you," one woman murmured as she passed me in the grocery store. "It isn't right." Others avoided me altogether, afraid of what the board might do if they were seen associating with me. But the tide was shifting. People were beginning to realize the board wasn't invincible. And when people stop fearing their oppressors, that's when real change begins. As for me, I wasn't just fighting for my land anymore. I was fighting for every resident who'd ever been bullied into compliance, every homeowner fined for leaving a trash can out too long, every family harassed over a paint color or a flower bed. The HOA had turned the subdivision into a battlefield, and they'd underestimated the resolve of the man they stole from. By the end of the month, the investigation was in full swing. The county scrambled to explain their negligence, pointing fingers at notaries and clerks. The HOA tried to bury documents, but federal subpoenas have a way of digging up everything. And I just kept watching, waiting, and documenting every move they made. Because I knew the truth. This wasn't the end. This was just the opening salvo. The HOA thought they could bury me while I was deployed. But all they had really done was dig their own grave. The investigation moved faster than I expected. When the military steps into a civilian matter, people notice. County clerks who once shuffled papers lazily were suddenly returning phone calls within hours. Emails that might have sat unread for weeks were answered immediately. The HOA had poked the wrong bear, and now the full weight of federal law was bearing down on them. It began quietly, at least at first, a letter here, a summons there. The kind of paperwork that made board members sweat under their polo collars but didn't yet ripple across the community. But then came the repossession orders. That was the moment the HOA realized this wasn't just about me. This was about everything they had built on stolen land. One morning, I drove past the neighborhood entrance and noticed something strange. The shiny green and gold Evergreen Meadows sign, the one they'd proudly installed over what used to be my oak tree, was gone. In its place stood a temporary wooden board stamped with a bold black notice: property under federal review. Trespassing. Prohibited. The effect was immediate. Neighbors slowed their cars, gawking. Residents on morning jogs stopped to take pictures. The HOA president himself stood near the entrance, red-faced, arguing with two men in suits who ignored him completely. That was the first piece, but it wouldn't be the last. Within a week, contractors arrived, backed by military orders, to begin reclaiming parcels of land that the HOA had absorbed illegally. Surveyors pounded stakes into the ground, marking boundaries the board had conveniently forgotten when expanding their control. What had once been declared community property was now sectioned off, tagged and logged as part of the investigation. And right at the heart of it all was my home. The padlock came off first, removed not by me but by officials who had the authority to declare the HOA's claim null and void. Watching that lock snap open felt like watching chains fall away. The door creaked as it swung inward, dust motes drifting through the stale air. My house was exactly as I'd left it, only colder, emptier, violated by months of unauthorized control. Inside, I found HOA notices piled on the counter. Threats of fines, warnings of foreclosure, even letters claiming I had abandoned my responsibilities as a community member. Each one was signed by the same smug board president, his name scrawled like a brand of ownership. I gathered them carefully, stacking them into a neat pile. Evidence. Every single page was evidence. But the repossession didn't stop at my property. Oh no, the military wasn't about to let the HOA keep the spoils of their fraud. Entire sections of the subdivision were declared contested, placed under review until the investigation concluded. Streets the board had proudly paved with inflated HOA dues were now lined with signs warning residents not to engage in further construction or improvements. The board's meetings grew frantic. I could hear them through thin walls and open windows, raised voices, slamming fists, panicked whispers about lawsuits and liabilities. For the first time in years, they weren't issuing threats. They were scrambling for survival, and the residents noticed. People who once cowered under the board's rule began asking questions. Why is the military here? What did the HOA do? Are our dues even legal? The whispers spread faster than wildfire, igniting long-buried resentment. One afternoon, I stood on my porch, when a neighbor approached cautiously. She was older, the kind of woman the HOA usually preyed on with their arbitrary fines. She glanced around nervously before speaking. "They fined me $300 last year," she said softly, "because my grandson parked his truck in the driveway overnight. They said it wasn't allowed. Do you think that money was even legal?" I met her eyes. "Not if they forged property transfers to steal land." Her expression hardened. "Then I want it back." That was the crack in the dam. Within days, more. Neighbors came forward. Stories of outrageous fines, threats of liens, even intimidation at their own doorsteps. For years, the board had ruled by fear, confident no one would challenge them. But now, with the military unearthing their crimes, the residents finally saw the truth. The board wasn't powerful. They were parasites. The pressure mounted, and the board lashed out in desperation. They tried to frame the repossession as government overreach, painting me as a traitor who had invited outsiders into the community. Flyers appeared in mailboxes accusing me of destroying property values. The board president even held a meeting on his lawn, rallying his dwindling supporters with fiery speeches about protecting their neighborhood. But the speeches fell flat, because right behind him, in plain sight, stood federal contractors, removing HOA signage, loading it into trucks, and hauling it away as evidence. Every symbol of their authority was being dismantled piece by piece, right in front of their eyes. The climax of that week came when the Subdivision's clubhouse, once the pride of Evergreen Meadows, was officially seized. The very building where the board had issued their fines, hosted their smug meetings, and plotted their schemes was now padlocked by order of the federal government. A bold notice on the door read, "Sealed pending investigation." Neighbors gathered to watch as board members pounded helplessly on the doors, denied entry to the very place they once ruled. Some residents laughed, others filmed with their phones, capturing the downfall of an empire built on lies. I stood at the edge of the crowd, silent. Not gloating, not celebrating, just watching. Because I knew this wasn't the end. This was only the beginning. The HOA had stolen my land while I served overseas. In doing so, they thought they had erased me. But instead, they had triggered a reckoning that reached far beyond my property line. The military repossession was more than justice for me. It was justice for every homeowner they had ever exploited. And as the investigation dug deeper, I knew one thing for certain. The board's downfall was inevitable. They had written their own ending the moment they forged my signature. And now, that ending was being written across every street sign, every padlock, every boarded-up building in Evergreen Meadows. The subdivision wasn't theirs anymore. It was mine. The first signs of fracture within the HOA board were subtle but unmistakable. For years, they had operated as a monolithic unit, moving in lockstep, presenting a united front, no matter how questionable their actions. The board president barked commands, and the others obeyed, nodding dutifully while pocketing their share of control. But pressure does strange things to alliances. Under the weight of the military repossession and the looming federal investigation, the facade of unity began to crumble. I first noticed it during a tense morning walk through the subdivision. Neighbors had gathered near the shuttered clubhouse, whispering among themselves, when a shouting match erupted from inside a nearby house. The voices were sharp and angry, spilling through open windows for everyone to hear. The HOA treasurer accused the secretary of failing to file documents. The secretary hurled back that she had only followed the president's orders. Names were called, accusations thrown, and within minutes, a small crowd of residents stood frozen on the sidewalk, listening. The myth of the board's power was unraveling in real time. By the end of that week, the cracks became canyons. The board treasurer, a man notorious for demanding late fees at holiday parties, was suddenly absent from public appearances. Rumors swirled that he had been contacted directly by investigators and was considering cooperation in exchange for leniency. The vice president, once the board president's most loyal enforcer, was seen arguing with him in the driveway, jabbing her finger in his chest before storming off. The president tried to project confidence, but even his carefully rehearsed speeches at hastily called community meetings rang hollow. Gone was the booming certainty of a man in control. In its place was the brittle edge of desperation. His voice cracked when he spoke, his hands twitched when he gestured, and his words, empty reassurances about how everything was under control, were drowned out by murmurs of disbelief from the crowd. Meanwhile, the military investigation pressed forward. Teams of officials combed through the board's records, seizing files and computer hard drives. Trucks rolled in and out, carrying boxes of evidence. Every seizure was another nail in the coffin, and everyone knew it. One particularly telling moment came when investigators posted notices on several of the board members' personal properties, marking them for review. Suddenly, the enforcers of community rules were finding themselves on the receiving end of federal scrutiny. Their driveways were blocked, their garages searched, their basements cataloged. The neighbors they once bullied stood on lawns, arms crossed, watching with grim satisfaction. But the most striking shift wasn't in the board, it was in the community. For the first time in years, residents began to stand tall. Without the board's shadow looming over them, people discovered voices they had long suppressed. A young couple repainted their shutters in bright, non-approved colors. An older man parked his RV in the driveway, daring anyone to fine him. Kids played basketball in the street without fear of reprimand. It was as if a weight had been lifted from the neighborhood's shoulders and they weren't about to let it return. And yet, amidst the chaos, I remained cautious, because desperate people don't go quietly. Sure enough, the board president launched a campaign of retaliation. Flyers appeared in mailboxes accusing me of colluding with the military to destroy property values. Posts surfaced on the community forum calling me a traitor who had invited government overreach into their quiet neighborhood. He even attempted to rally support with promises that once they fought this injustice, dues would be reduced and fines forgiven. But the residents weren't buying it. Not anymore. One evening, as the sun dipped low and cast long shadows across the repossessed clubhouse, I overheard a conversation between two neighbors. "Remember when they fined me for my garden hose?" one said bitterly. "Yeah," the other replied. "Now look at them. Can't even keep their own houses straight." The bitterness was contagious. Every slight, every unfair fine, every moment of intimidation resurfaced. People were no longer afraid of the board. They were angry, and anger is a dangerous thing, for the board at least. As weeks passed, investigators revealed more damning evidence. Bank records showed misuse of HOA funds, including personal vacations disguised as board retreats. Property transfers traced back to forged signatures, including mine, were presented as part of the mounting case. The evidence painted a clear picture. This wasn't mismanagement. It was theft, organized, deliberate, and systemic. The treasurer, sensing the inevitable, was the first to flip. Word spread quickly that he had met with investigators behind closed doors. His silence at board meetings, once seen as loyalty, was now understood as self-preservation. The secretary followed shortly after, distancing herself publicly from the president's leadership. By the time the vice president openly accused the president of dragging them all into ruin, their collapse was undeniable. The once ironclad board was reduced to bickering factions, each one scrambling to save themselves. And through it all, I watched, not out of cruelty, but out of necessity. Because this was justice unfolding. For every sleepless night I endured overseas, wondering if my home would still be mine when I returned. For every resident who had been humiliated, fined, or threatened. For every ounce of arrogance the board displayed as they trampled on the people they claimed to represent. The military repossession was no longer just about my land. It was about accountability. It was about showing that even the most entrenched, power-drunk HOA couldn't escape consequences forever. The neighborhood had become a battlefield of a different kind, one where truth, not weapons, would decide the victor. And as the cracks in the board widened, I knew the final collapse was inevitable. They had built their empire on lies, and now those lies were caving in, piece by piece, day by day. Evergreen Meadows was no longer theirs. It was a community in rebellion, rising from the ashes of their corruption. And soon, the reckoning would be complete. The board president wasn't a man to accept defeat gracefully. For years, he had ruled Evergreen Meadows like a petty king, issuing decrees and expecting obedience. Even as the investigation gutted his power and his allies deserted him one by one, he clung to the illusion of control. And in that desperation, he made his final, reckless move. It began with a letter. Not the official notices we had grown accustomed to. Those were long gone, replaced by federal documents and repossession orders. But a handwritten note slipped under every door in the subdivision. The message was scrawled in heavy ink, each word pressed hard into the paper as if carved by anger. Neighbors, do not be fooled. The government has no right to interfere in our community. Together, we must resist. Meet at the clubhouse this Saturday to reclaim what is ours. Evergreen. Meadows belongs to us, not outsiders, not traitors. The irony was staggering. The very clubhouse he had once locked us out of, the building now sealed under investigation, was to be the rallying point for his so-called resistance. It was a desperate gamble, and everyone knew it. By Saturday, the neighborhood was buzzing with speculation. Some feared violence, others dismissed it as the last gasp of a man too stubborn to admit defeat. I walked the streets that morning, watching groups of residents whisper in hushed tones, pointing toward the clubhouse with wary glances. For many, curiosity outweighed caution, and by afternoon a small crowd had gathered near the building. The president arrived shortly after, striding down the street in his crisp polo and slacks. The same uniform he had worn for years like a badge of authority. But this time, the swagger was gone. His eyes darted nervously, his shoulders hunched, his jaw clenched tight. He carried a stack of papers in one hand and gestured wildly with the other as he launched into his speech. He spoke of tyranny and government overreach. He painted me as a puppet of the military, accusing me of selling out my neighbors for personal gain. He warned of property values plummeting, of homes lost, of lives ruined, unless they stood with him. But his words no longer carried weight. The residents listened in silence, their faces unreadable. A few crossed their arms, unimpressed. Others shook their heads, muttering under their breath. And then, slowly but surely, voices rose, not in support, but in opposition. You fined me for my fence color. You threatened to line my house over weeds. You took our money and never fixed the pool. Each accusation landed like a hammer blow. The crowd shifted, turning against him with every passing moment. His desperate pleas dissolved into shouting, his arguments reduced to angry rants. The more he spoke, the smaller he seemed. And then came the moment that sealed his fate. A pair of federal agents approached, their presence unmistakable in dark suits and measured steps. They held documents, warrants, official and unassailable. The crowd parted as they advanced, silence falling like a curtain. The president's voice faltered as they addressed him directly, informing him that he was under investigation for fraud, forgery, and misuse of funds. He sputtered in protest, waving his papers wildly, insisting that the neighborhood was his domain. But the agents were unmoved. They took him by the arm and led him away, his shouts echoing off the clubhouse walls. The residents stood in stunned silence. For years, this man had wielded unchecked power, dictating the smallest details of their lives. Now he was nothing more than a disgraced figure being escorted out in front of everyone he had once ruled. And in that silence, something remarkable happened. A cheer rose, tentative at first, then louder, until it swelled into a roar. People clapped, whistled, even laughed with relief. The weight of oppression had finally lifted, and the community celebrated its release. Stood at the edge of the crowd, watching it all unfold. The man who had stolen my land, who had tried to erase me while I served my country, was gone. The board was shattered, their power stripped away, their crimes laid bare. For the first time since I had returned home, I felt truly vindicated. But the story wasn't over yet, because justice is not just about removing the corrupt, it's about rebuilding what they destroyed. In the days that followed, residents began to meet informally, discussing what would come next. Without the HOA's heavy hand, they were free to decide for themselves. Some suggested forming a voluntary association focused only on shared resources. Others preferred no organization at all, each homeowner responsible only for their own property. The debates were lively but respectful, a stark contrast to the years of intimidation and fear. For the first time, people had a choice, and that choice was theirs alone to make. Meanwhile, the investigation continued. The treasurer's cooperation led to further revelations. Accounts drained for personal luxuries, secret deals with contractors, even bribes disguised as maintenance fees. Every discovery only reinforced the righteousness of the repossession. The subdivision wasn't just mismanaged, it had been systematically exploited. Neighbors who once viewed me with suspicion now approached with gratitude. They thanked me for standing up, for not letting the board's crimes go unchecked. Some offered meals, others shared stories of their own struggles under the HOA's reign. Together, we pieced together a picture of years of abuse finally coming to an end. And yet, beneath the relief, there was a lingering question. What would happen to Evergreen Meadows now? The land that had been stolen was mine again, legally and without dispute. The properties seized during the investigation would face their own legal resolutions, but the community itself, broken, betrayed, and scarred by years of corruption, would need time to heal. I knew this battle had changed me. It wasn't just about reclaiming my home anymore, it was about ensuring that no one else would endure what I had. It was about honoring the service I had given overseas by fighting for justice here at home. As the sun set on the day of the president's arrest, I stood once more on my porch, the air filled with the sound of children playing freely in the street. Their laughter echoed across the subdivision, a sound more powerful than any gavel or order. The HOA had taken my land while I was deployed. They had underestimated me, underestimated the law, and underestimated the strength of a community pushed too far. Now their reign was over, and though the fight had been long, the victory was sweeter for it. The last stand of the HOA had failed. But for Evergreen Meadows, a new beginning had just begun. The downfall of the HOA president was not the end of the story, it was the beginning of something much larger. For years, Evergreen Meadows had been a place of quiet resentment, where residents lived under constant fear of arbitrary fines and sudden punishments. But now, with the board dismantled and its corruption laid bare, the community faced a question that no one had dared to ask before. What kind of neighborhood did they want to be? The first weeks after the president's arrest were filled with both relief and uncertainty. The federal investigation rolled on, with agents interviewing residents, cataloging evidence, and tracing every dollar the board had misused. But for the people who lived there, daily life was changing in ways that were impossible to ignore. Mailboxes no longer carried threatening notices about lawn lengths or mailbox paint colors. Driveways were filled with cars without fear of predatory fines. Kids rode their bikes freely through the streets, their laughter carrying through the air like a signal of freedom. It was as though an invisible cage had been lifted. Still, not everything was easy. Without the HOA, there were questions about shared spaces. Who would take care of the walking trails, the playground, the entrance sign that now stood bare after its gaudy Evergreen Meadows emblem was stripped away? Some worried the neighborhood would fall into chaos, with no one maintaining order. Others argued that too much order had been the problem all along. A meeting was called, not by a board, not by officials, but by the residents themselves. They gathered in the very field where the clubhouse once loomed as a symbol of control, now sealed and silent. Families brought lawn chairs, kids tossed footballs nearby, and for the first time in years the atmosphere was one of hope rather than tension. I stood among them, not as a soldier or an enemy of the HOA, but as a neighbor. Voices rose as people shared their thoughts. Some wanted no organization at all, each homeowner left entirely to their own property. Others suggested a voluntary committee, something light and flexible, without the power to fine or control. The debate was spirited but respectful, a sharp contrast to the iron-fisted rule of the HOA board. What struck me most was how quickly people began to trust themselves again. For so long, they had been conditioned to believe the board was necessary, that without its watchful eye, everything would collapse. But as neighbors talked, laughed, and planned together, it became clear that the strength of a community came, not from rules, but from people. As the investigation reached its conclusion, the verdict was damning. The HOA had not only sold my land illegally while I was deployed, but had engaged in years of fraudulent activity, forged signatures, embezzled funds, kickbacks from shady contractors. The list of crimes seemed endless. The president faced multiple charges, and his former allies, once eager to enforce his will, were left scrambling to avoid prison sentences themselves. The federal government issued its final order. Evergreen Meadows would no longer operate under an HOA. The organization was dissolved, its assets seized, and its authority permanently stripped. The reaction was immediate. Cheers erupted across the subdivision. People hugged their neighbors, tears of relief and joy shining in their eyes. For years they had lived under the shadow of control, but now they were free, truly free. I walked through the streets that night, watching porch lights glow warmly as families celebrated. The air was alive with conversation and laughter, with plans for the future that no longer involved fear of punishment. And for the first time since returning home, I felt at peace. My house was mine again. My land was secure, but more importantly, my neighbors had reclaimed their dignity. The HOA had tried to erase me while I was overseas, but in doing so, they had written their own downfall. Now, Evergreen Meadows was not a subdivision ruled by a corrupt board. It was a neighborhood reborn. As I stood on my porch, watching the stars glimmer above, I realized that this story wasn't just about revenge. It was about resilience. It was about what happens when ordinary people stand up against those who abuse power. It was about justice, hard-won and undeniable. And as much as this chapter of the battle was closed, I knew the lessons of it would live on. Because when you fight for what's right, you don't just reclaim land. You reclaim hope. You reclaim freedom. You reclaim community. The HOA had stolen from us. But in the end, they gave us something far greater, the strength to take our lives back. And that's the end of this saga. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe, like, share, and drop a comment below. It helps more than you know, and it ensures you'll never miss the next story when it drops.